Hello, friends. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Caderna podcast. I'm your host, Brian Caderna. So, in today's episode, we're going to take a very deep dive into international trade and macroeconomics. This conversation is nuanced, and we only scratch the surface of what's happening with US China relations, the EU, Canada, Mexico, and more. Let me say this: trade is an extremely complex issue. If you've ever read the famous essay, I Pencil by Leonard Read, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's an often overlooked topic, but one that affects us all every day. My guest expert is Henrietta Treyz. If you're not familiar, let me give you a quick bio. Henrietta is the managing partner and director of economic policy research at Veda Partners, providing investors with election and economic analysis for over 15 years. She's led the Veda macroeconomic policy team through the COVID era stimulus bill, the US China trade wars, the Great Recession, financial service reform, healthcare reform, and trade policies of multiple administrations. Previously, Henrietta led the macroeconomic policy team at a DC based broker dealer for 8 years after serving in the US Senate, where she covered the Senate Finance, Banking, and Budget committees. Prior to serving in the US Senate, Henrietta covered tax, financial services, and deficit issues for the US Chamber of Commerce and served as a research fellow to Congressman Joe Crowley of New York. Before moving to Washington, Henrietta spent several years as a research associate at Zweig Domena, a longstanding hedge fund in New York. She holds a BA in political science and literature from Fordham University and is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, Bloomberg, NPR, and many other news outlets. Joining me from New Orleans, here is Henrietta Treyz.
Is going to require work and time and sweat and toil.
If money wasn't an issue, what would I be doing?
Don't worry about it. You'll figure it out.
Change is the only constant.
The Caderna Podcast.
Henrietta, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you for making some time. That is quite a bio.
Yeah, I'm sorry you had to read all that.
No, that was a very interesting journey that you've had. Is this something, just out of curiosity, growing up, did you know you wanted to get into the political realm?
I did not, although I did grow up in the age of the West Wing. So that was probably instrumental. My dad had a hedge fund when I was a kid. And so I always knew the sort of hedge fund space. Growing up in New York, you're going to be in the financial industry. And so starting off there, but getting into college and realizing that I was really into politics is what changed the game for me.
That's great. That's awesome. And so were conversations back home more finance, business, or did politics get in there? I know these can be some touchy subjects.
I remember distinctly as a little girl, my dad letting me invest in Disney World because I thought that stock was extremely cool. Obviously, as a little kid, thinking that Mickey Mouse and finding a way to invest in Disney World was just awesome. So there was certainly a bit of that. But I will tell you, a big part of it was just by sheer chance. My apartment caught fire my junior year of college, and I had nowhere to live at school, and I had the summer vacation, and I went down to DC and did an internship on the Hill with Joe Crowley, as you mentioned, who represented the Bronx and Queens, the most diverse district in the country, actually, and got hooked. And so that was it. I spent a couple more years in New York after that, and then got down to DC.
That's awesome. And so as we kind of fast forward to your bread and butter, of how this whole political sphere affects economics and then, of course, investors, it's such a strange thing. I feel like when I have people here on the show, if we talk about other countries, take a Russia or a China that could have like a 20-year, even further timeline of those type of governments where they frankly have dictators. And then you come to America where it just seems like we have this constant shuffle. Every couple of years for midterms, every 4 years for the White House, where it's like the direction of our country can pivot quickly. How big of an impact is that on the markets? Or is it more like the American economy just goes on its way, we innovate, and then you have the Fed over here that can pull these levers? I know there's a lot of factors at play, but I guess could you kind of rank almost like where the political shifts affect investors?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a phenomenal question. I would say that, every 4 years we have the largest political volatility event, the largest market volatility event of, at least the year that you're in when there's a presidential election cycle. And that's grown exponentially since I would say the Affordable Care Act was passed because Congress just started getting so much more involved in the markets. I'm obviously colored by my time in the Senate, but when we started doing the financial bailouts and TARP, and everybody was glued not to CNBC but to C-SPAN to
Hmm.
watch those votes come through on TARP to see if we were going to get Hank Paulson's bazooka, that really never went away. And the Affordable Care Act put what is healthcare, 16% of the US economy in the market, square in everybody's headlights. And since then, investors effectively can't do their job without understanding where the votes are in Washington, who is going to be president, who the House and Senate are run by. I would go a step further and say that it's not as volatile as it appears.
Okay.
That's because the president can do some things, of course. This president coming up obviously has launched a trade war with China, and that's very market impacting and a big, huge shift. But that's continued under Biden, and it'll come back with even greater force under Trump, I think, next year. But the tax bill, for example, is something that you could predict regardless of who's in the White House. That really is just to do with the Senate. And I would say up front and acknowledge, admittedly, that I am a huge Senate snob, but the senators are the ones who write legislation. They're every 6 years, a third of the Senate gets reelected every 2 years. They're much more plotting and predictable than the volatility that is implied by a big headline risk event like a presidential election.
Okay, interesting. And then your research and your studies, how much does that involve the Fed? Because, investors are always saying you can't fight the Fed, and it seems like sometimes our politicians react to what the Fed is doing, and the Fed's kind of leading the way. And then other times you could look at it from another angle and say, well, the Fed is just reacting to this environment that politicians create. Is kind of the cart before the horse, chicken, the egg? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I will just tout Marty Zweig there, my former hedge fund that I worked at. Marty Zweig is the one who famously said, "Don't fight the Fed."
Hmm.
And I think that's exactly right. In my experience, which is really colored by the Great Recession, the Fed exists to almost respond to what Congress is going to do. So right now we're very focused on the deficit blowout that we're about to get, the inflationary components of the tariffs, how the Fed's going to respond to that. In my core formative years in the space, the Fed worked alongside with and in conjunction with the crises that were happening and was very aware of what Congress was going to do to see what else they needed to do. So they go together. They are and remain separate. I'm not a Fed watcher. I'm not that kind of analyst. I'm much more focused on Congress. But in my view, the Fed is reactionary and would like to have the ability to lower interest rates if we go into a recession, knowing that Congress can only do so much, or hike interest rates, knowing that Congress is going to blow out the deficit and spend, and there maybe needs to be some tempering in the market. So I see them coordinating, but the Fed very much responding to what Congress can or cannot do.
Got it. Okay, well said. And so if we go back to kind of like you said, where you really earned your stripes during the Great Recession, I think something a lot of people wonder about, and whether it was, all these various recessions coming from the Great Depression all the way up to the dot-com bubble, and then, of course, 2008, can something like that of that magnitude happen again? And because it seems like, these events happen and then we install all these different safety measures so that we never see that day again. But then maybe it comes back in kind of like a different way, shape, or form. Have we insulated ourselves enough as an economy so that something like a Great Depression or a Great Recession is very unlikely, at least?
Man, you're making me want to knock on wood right now. I feel like it's just been crises since 2007,
Hmm.
whether it's the financial crisis or the slow slog of pulling out of that, then walking straight into a pandemic. There just keeps being new things every couple of years. The trade war, I think, has really blown up a lot of trade relationships, and I think that there's a lot to do there with export control restrictions, with sanctions, wars breaking out. A massive breakdown in the US economy is something that's not currently on the radar, but with the growth of AI, and you never know what disruptions that's going to generate, I think you always have to be prepared. And I would never say, just based off my experience alone, that there's not going to be another major crisis to deal with. It seems like we're just moving from crisis to crisis every couple of years, but I am particularly exposed to it, so maybe I'm biased.
Yeah, and the thing that's crazy is it does seem a crisis to crisis. We always have this chaos that we're dealing with, but along the way, we have watched as investors the stock market just climb, climb, climb. And yet we'll have our pullback, like we did in 22. But it's just seems so resilient. And now what everyone, of course, is worried about is it getting, too frothy where the market's just going up, back to back years here of well north of 20% returns, barring something crazy in the next couple of weeks. You just kind of wonder the correlation between stock market performance and then, yes, these crises that we see all around the world. That correlation there is quite confusing sometimes.
It is confusing, and 20% returns year over year is something that you have to wonder, how long is this sustainable for? But I find investors are just so intelligent and able to find a way to make money even in a crisis, that's sort of what we've seen. We had a shutdown of the entire globe in COVID, but immediately the stock market bounced right back up because investors are so savvy and so well equipped to adapt to whatever is thrown at them. So I honestly feel like we could run into a trade war with the EU, with China, with India, with Canada and Mexico, and folks would find a way to make money off of it. I'm endlessly impressed at the inventiveness of our clients.
Yeah. And I think one thing I always tell clients too is, the stock market is kind of like a measure of liquidity. And where interest rates are at now, I think that gives some comfort that, okay, if the Fed wants to leave them there, we look at the markets performing pretty well. The economy as a whole is doing okay. If we did have that sort of shock, either from the trade war or something else, they still have a lot of bandwidth to cut rates, inject more capital and liquidity into the market, which would be a good thing. I think that fear is when rates are like near zero. And then if something crazy happens, that just takes away so much of our ammunition that I don't know. I mean, I know the Fed, you're not a Fed watcher. I just don't think rates should get to like rock bottom and try to stay there.
You're speaking my language. I feel very strongly about that as well. I think having gone through the recession and having it be so bad, you always want to have the ability to stimulate.
Yes.
You're always trying to find a way to preserve your ability to stimulate the US economy, whether that's in a very small scale provision like 100% bonus depreciation for corporations to encourage them to go out and buy a brand new John Deere tractor, some massive investment that spurs economic growth. That's one thing that you can have in your quiver. The other is cutting Fed interest rates. All of the tax code, in my outlook, the way that I approach it is, are we in a recession now? Do we see a recession coming in the future? Can we do anything to preserve power of things that we can pass quickly that will be stimulative immediately? One of the big pushbacks to dropping the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% is now you really can't go much lower. To stimulate the economy. When I approach it, and I'm chronically afraid of going into some sort of recession, I get PTSD every time I get near the TARP window vote of September and October. You really want to remember, what can I do to stimulate the economy in the event that we need it? You never want to boost the economy when you don't need it and overjuice it.
Correct.
I love the Fed having the ability to reduce interest rates right now. It gives me a lot of comfort, and I enjoyed watching it go up. I know that it's painful, but it gives me some comfort knowing that there's a way to come down from whatever might come.
True. And so, to kind of pivot into some of the concerns I think people have out there, one that is just front and center, but I feel like the number has gotten so gargantuan that people are almost ignoring it. We're numb to it. If we look at our national debt now at about $36 trillion, it's just this inconceivable number. And it seems like it's just a train that's running out of control. And then a lot of people, economists will then say, well, does it even really matter? Like there's relativity to everything. What's your take on our debt situation, and does it matter?
I believe I have The Deficit Myth, the book, right behind me here. It's worth being aware of everybody's opinions on this. I would speak maybe from my experience with investors. In the last 5 years, the people who've really noticed this issue have been international clients, folks who are from England and have experienced what it's like to go through a situation where your currency is not exactly the the sterling that it used to be, where the deficits get too big. We just don't have that kind of institutional experience in America. And that makes American investors a lot less concerned about the deficit. So I do think that that is a component. However, in the last, I want to say 4 months, 3 months even, that has materially shifted. And I go to lunches where it used to be, two international clients from Japan or the UK who were talking about the deficit, to now you spend 30 minutes talking about it with domestic investors. So I think it's definitely shifting. And the part of the reason for that is just the sheer scale of extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. When you hear the number 4.6 trillion just to keep things static and not stimulate at all, that's mind blowing to folks. And there are a lot of budget gimmicks that get used. My time on the budget committee was very informative in understanding what the gimmicks are that Congress uses. So I guess I would just be really blunt and say there is no plan to reduce the deficit. So it will continue to go up. And it's, the market can decide whether or not that matters, but it will continue to go up without question. Next week, we're going to increase the Defense Authorization Act. This is a 1% increase over fiscal year 2024. The continuing resolution will fund the government into March, and it'll be, a $1.7 trillion spending rate for 2025, a continued plus up. And we'll see that going forward. And then we're going to pass, a spending bill on energy, immigration, and defense. And then we'll do another probably $2.5 trillion deficit increasing tax bill later on in the year. So it is going to go up, and we have to increase the debt ceiling.
Yeah, no, we're addicted to spending. And it feels like, you think, oh, debt, that seems like a naughty word. But it's as the debt goes up more and faster, it seems like that perhaps that's where maybe there's a correlation to the stock market. Again, that there's just more funds, more stimulus of some sort that's kind of infiltrating the economy, whether it be through the tax cuts or through new programs, subsidies, anything like that. But I guess my question would be like, how does it get bad? How does that, I don't want to say blow up, but like, are there some examples maybe in history where a country got carried away with debt and then they saw that unravel and it created some sort of meltdown or shock to the economy?
Sure. I mean, you can go back to Rome if you want. You can go to the UK if you want for direct examples. I would say, to address the question directly, I would say, show me somebody better. Show me a nation that's in a better position than we are. One of the things that, volatility creates is opportunity, and that spurs growth. It just does, as you see in GDP growth. Sure, our interest costs are extraordinarily high, and it'd be great if we could get that down, but we continue to have a robust consumer base, robust travel. I mean, Americans single-handedly kept a number of European countries out of recession this summer alone with the Eras Tour. It's things like that America continues to generate and develop. I think AI is at the forefront of that, technology. The trade war with China creates domestic manufacturing here. And that's something that was spurred on by the 4 massive pieces of legislation passed by Joe Biden. The Chips and Sciences Act, spurring billions of dollars of investment in semiconductor manufacturing plants across the United States, in Ohio and other states that, just get more economic growth, more high-paying, high-skilled jobs. The Inflation Reduction Act creating a brand new clean energy marketplace that they anticipated would be something in the range of $200 billion in private sector investment and uptake, and is now $780 billion in private sector uptake in solar panels, wind, batteries, et cetera. I mean, the growth is just here. It just is that. The inventiveness, the R&D is in the United States, and it's hard to get negative when we have so much of that on the horizon.
Got it. So I guess in that, like the kind of the budget or the debt situation, is that where people say, hey, we're still kind of the tallest midget in the room? Is that the idea there, that as long as we're growing, the debt is then not such a factor?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I would say that the growth is something, the continued spend is everywhere. So whether that's on investing in new subsidization for domestic shipping, shipbuilding, semiconductor chips, AI, quantum computing, the emerging economies, there's going to be additional stimulus on that front, subsidization, domestic subsidization, and that's what we should expect.
And is that something, it sounds like at least we're kind of moving in the right direction, especially when you talk about the chips, like how everything we could possibly think of seems to be impacted by these microchips. And as far as we know, it's like Taiwan kind of dominates that space. Are we going to become self-sufficient in that? Do we want to be? Is that something that like we need to be independent, or can we continue to kind of have these relationships abroad where we say, "Hey, we're not the best at this and that's okay."
That's a great question. And maybe to circle back to your original question, this is the difference between one administration and another. I think the Biden administration endeavored to find multinational allies that we could work with to shore up NATO, to work closely with Taiwan, to have those relationships so that if and when we do have to combat Russia, China, Iran, or others, we're in a position of having a big force to go in and challenge these nations with together. The Trump administration has a very different approach, which is fracture all those trade relationships, cut them down to size, break them so that we can build that back up and fix them. But they're much more bilateral. So a single minded negotiation with the EU and the US, or even Canada and Mexico, or India and the US, China and the US. When we think about one of the reasons that I don't anticipate a blanket tariff the way that Trump campaigned on the trail is because it's inconsistent with what we saw from his first term, which was not treat every nation the same with the same level of tariff. It was go line by line through every single nation that we trade with and endeavor to have bilateral negotiations with them one-on-one, as opposed to a multinational approach.
Okay. And what's to that point, what's some of your take on tariffs? Because I feel like pre-Trump, that was something that didn't get a lot of attention, or again, it was one of those kind of taboo words you didn't bring up too much. And then he unleashes, or it seems unleashes these tariffs. That was in 2018. But then, there was a lot of negative talk about that. But then Biden kept those tariffs and recently increased a lot of them, on the Chinese EVs, on the solar cells and things of that nature. What's maybe some of your take on the tariff situation, on this trade war, if you will? I know from, again, an investor standpoint, like if we look at 2018 when that came out, that was the one negative year in the stock market of Trump's administration. The market was down S&P was down about 6% or so. What do you think that does moving forward? Is it a good thing, bad thing, from an economic standpoint or investor standpoint?
I would say overarchingly, I agree with the sentiment that no one wins a trade war. And I think you just described why perfectly. President Trump and his US Trade Representative, Bob Lighthizer, created a very novel strategy of using the Section 301 investigation to challenge China's intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, state subsidization, non-free market activities. And then in 2018, right after the tax bill was finished and they no longer needed Congress, and Trump no longer needed to have the Republicans in the Senate, who are the caucus that used to be pro-free trade and now are pro-fair trade, which did not exist as a concept in the past, has turned into a conference that now supports these tariffs. It's the single largest distinction between the pre-Trump era and the post-Trump era in the Republican Party. This is a party that used to want free trade agreements with everybody, 0% tariffs, trade around the globe with zero tariff rates, and now is a party that's standing by as Trump imposes list 1 tariffs, list 2 tariffs, list 3, list 4A tariffs on $350 billion worth of goods coming in from China, Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum from the EU, Japan, Canada, Mexico. It's the biggest change that I've witnessed in my 20 years of experience with lawmakers from the Republican Party shift on this. So going ahead, what is interesting here is that Trump is really a lot more like a traditional Democrat on tariffs. And I remember going into the House Trade Subcommittee back when these tariffs were first being developed, and the Democrats on that committee were sort of shocked that he was tariff man, and they were the ones that had this view that maybe China should be challenged and you're hurting domestic workers and unions and laborers in America. Bring manufacturing back. Joe Biden has overseen 1,000 manufacturing jobs in the last 4 years, largely because the tariffs have escalated, as you pointed out, and the subsidization of the Chips and Sciences Act, the infrastructure bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act. But as you suggest, the tariffs have stayed on under Biden, which is why I say nobody wins a trade war. They stay on and they become a permanent feature. And Ambassador Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative under Biden, put tariffs on just yesterday on tungsten at 25%, wafers at 50%, and polysilicon at 50%. So they just stay with us. They become a permanent part of the landscape.
And it's so weird to me because like when you hear all the campaigning stuff, it was like, all right, Trump is proudly waving the tariff flag that he's going to use that as his weapon. And then it seemed like, Harris or Biden and then Harris were very much opposed that just because that was like his calling card. They said, all right, we're going to go on the opposite side. But then in reality, it seems like this is a bipartisan thing where they're both using tariffs, whether it's Biden right now or Trump to come. So is that something that we actually have agreement on both sides of the aisle?
I think it's a little bit more complex than that. A big part of it is because I mentioned the Section 301 investigation. The purpose of these tariffs is not the tariffs in and of themselves, though Trump does find this a very convenient way to raise revenue, in theory, to pay for the $4.6 trillion cost of extending the existing tax rates. But what you have to think about with trade strategy is how can America take the tariffs off? Has China delivered on reining in intellectual property theft? No. Have they reined in forced technology transfer? No. They haven't even bought more soybeans. The phase one trade agreement consisted of a deal for China to purchase $80 billion more in our agriculture exports over 2 years. They did not even achieve that. So not only do we get a change to state subsidization and non-free market policies out of China, indeed, they're ramping them up even now in preparation for the next trade war. So it's impossible for one administration after another to give up or remove tariffs in what would be a reward to China for nothing in exchange. So once you put these tariffs on, you're stuck unless you think that China is going to bend a knee. President Xi is obviously not doing that right now, which is why I expect the tariffs to increase again in the next year.
And how is the Chinese economy doing? Because a lot of the headlines that you hear, it doesn't sound very good. Like when you had kind of a bit of a real estate crisis there, they have some of their own debt issues along those lines. They have a bit of an aging crisis, kind of like we do here in America, but they're just so much bigger. I mean, it's just a huge country. Is that one of those things where like this could get to be like these tariffs could become an irritant that then it really is impacting their economy if they're not doing so hot on their own and they're also getting these slaps on the wrist from America?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. I think, there is the theory that this is the peak Xi movement right now, where he has 8 years left, let's say, to continue being the, major presence and president, a leader, sort of uncontested in China. And so this is when he is at his most dangerous. And when Trump says, communism is a perk that we don't have in America, that's exactly right. I mean, he can state subsidize. He can environments with red tape or the removal of red tape with the snap of his fingers. Whereas we have to go through Congress, we have to deal with the Fed, as you mentioned, we have to deal with the House and the Senate dynamics. He doesn't have to deal with any of that. So there's this idea that a client of mine told me a couple of years back that makes a lot of sense, this idea of the 888 rule, where China will, in response to our tariffs, eat 8% of the tariff via currency devaluation, eat another 8% via state subsidization, and then pass 8% on to the domestic manufacturer in China of whatever the product is they're shipping over to the United States, thus mitigating the tariff once it hits U.S. consumers and maintaining the flow, the trade flow. The question is, as we plan to escalate to tariffs in the 50 or 60% range, above the 25% rate that they're at right now, how much of that can China really eat? What President Xi is doing right now is laying the table to eat quite a bit more, make sure that the trade flow is maintained. And the added benefit of this that I think a lot of diplomats would tell you is that China gets to go out to the rest of the world, Brazil, Argentina, Africa, India, Russia, and other nations, and say, America is the bully. America is the aggressor. Don't you want to please come to our side? And hey, we'll buy your soybeans. Argentina and Brazil have expanded exponentially their agricultural growth that trades with China. And that's what has U.S. farmers so concerned, is that they are permanently losing market share. So we can bail out our farmers. We did it 3 times under Trump in his first administration in a bailout that was even larger than the auto bailout. We can keep doing that. But in the long term, Brazil and Argentina are eating our market share by getting more crops into China. And we're never going to get those back. So that's something that they have to contest with.
So from what I'm hearing from you, a lot of kind of almost pros and cons, it seems. What would your solution be to this?
Well, I don't think that escalation works. I think there's a lot of hope that somehow China is going to come to the table or there's going to be deals reached. I think Japan serves as an example of where a deal was reached and we took the Section 232 tariffs off of Japan. But our negotiations with Europe are at a standstill, and they have been for a century because they don't want our genetically modified poultry and they don't want our cheese. You can't really blame them. They have excellent cheese of their own, and they don't want the ones from Wisconsin. So trying to break the EU, I think, is not in our best interest because you can so easily form a better union with them by using carrots instead of sticks. With China on the tariff front, it just seems sort of unnecessary because we can limit their military growth, their emerging economy access by restricting sales of chips and technology to the nation as a whole. We don't need to hurt US consumers.
Are we doing that already too?
Exactly. So the Bureau of Industry and Security is going gangbusters with export control restrictions on dozens of items that will now never get to China. We're restricting their inbound and outbound investment. We are cutting them off at the pass. I find that to be a far more effective way of yielding the result that you're hoping for than, taxing scented candles or baseball bats or gloves or backpacks and everything we buy for the holiday and back to school season.
Interesting. Very interesting. So as we kind of move on, I know that's one we could have a whole episode probably on just the China-America trade war. Do you have any maybe closing thoughts on that before we kind of maybe move to another topic?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of the street, there's this sense that the tariffs are not real. And I would just say, if you're gonna believe that we don't need revenue to pay for the tax extension, then the tariffs can be not real. But we do very much need the revenue. And Trump believes that there is revenue to be had from tariffs. Therefore, the tariffs must go on. So I take this all very seriously. The second layer of value here that I would remind people of is that it was easy to predict the tariffs in his first term, that they would come in 2018 because that's when he no longer needed Congress. So next year he needs Congress to oppose the tax bill and to pass the tax bill. But after that, for the next 3 years, he's not going to pass legislation through Congress. He doesn't need them. And that's when trade wars happen because you can do it unilaterally without Congress.
Interesting. Based on what you're saying, it almost sounds like it could just be a repeat where, yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So then it's from an investor standpoint, if you kind of put that hat on, it sounds like holding all things equal, we would have a repeat where, 2025 would be a pretty good year in the markets, even though we're coming off of 2 banner years. And then 2026, go tariff crazy. That would be the big correction.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. My only warning would be that if you think that there was a mandate in the last election where Trump won, all the swing states in the White House, Republicans picked up seats in the Senate, they lost a seat in the House, but they're still in the majority. So if you believe that that constitutes a mandate, I would say that the strongest area that Trump has convinced not just the Republican Party, but American voters is that tariffs work and that tariffs somehow bring in free money. I think there's a big misunderstanding of what tariffs are in the public, but 83% of Americans think that China's our number one threat. And that is, you can't get 83% of Americans to believe that water is wet. So this is a very serious position that Trump has convinced American voters of. And so I think that instead of waiting until year 2 for the tariffs, they're more likely to come immediately. I anticipate that he will pull out of the phase 1 trade agreement, within the first 100 days, maybe even on day 1. And tariffs could, if they adhere to the enforcement mechanism, tariffs would go on in June. But if they don't adhere to the enforcement mechanism, there's no reason they can't go on immediately.
Okay, so you're saying it may not have to wait until after, the renewal of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that it could be right out the gates, the tariffs could come this time?
I very much expect that, yes.
Okay, interesting. So maybe to just kind of pivot a little bit, this isn't just a US-China thing. I know that kind of dominates the picture here. And I agree with you that there is a lot of confusion around what tariffs are with the public. And I feel like it's just window dressing too. And I feel like Trump knows it's window dressing when he says, oh, the revenue from the tariffs will offset my tax cuts. I don't think he even believes that. I think that's just kind of like a nice little, well, we'll get a little bit here, so it helps. But I don't think that that's the driver, obviously in using the tariffs. I think anyone that believes that the numbers just don't add up. They're just such a huge disparity there. But what about the rest of the world? So, we talk a little bit about, United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, the USMCA, that I believe that would be in 2026, that would be up for renewal. What's going on there and how does that kind of tie into this big picture?
Yeah, we could definitely get into the USMCA. I think you raised an incredible point just now. And if you don't mind, I would just go into a little bit of depth because I think this is the most important
Yeah, please.
issue in DC. The whole deal with tariffs, and I say this as somebody who has, followed the really nerdy prospect of fiscal year budgets from the president and the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the House and the Senate. It's all very nerdy, but the whole gist of all of this is to paper over the fact that we are about to massively increase the deficit. That is a problem. That is historically a political problem, specifically for the Republican Party. So now you have a Republican Party that is going to need to find $4.6 trillion to keep tax rates where they are. That's just to avoid an increase. If you want to, remove taxes on tips, if you want to remove taxes on taking away Social Security benefits, the number can move to $8 trillion very quickly. So the most important piece of information in my mind that I'm constantly updating with my conversations with Republican staff in the House and the Senate is, what is your deficit appetite? How much can you take a vote for to increase the deficit in one bill? And that number is materially smaller than $4.6 trillion. It's in the $2 to $2.5 trillion range. So if that's your reality and you have to pass legislation, you have to find ways to paper over the reality that you are about to blow out the deficit. You can do it in myriad ways. You can have a billionaire come up with a plan to reduce federal spending. Boom, you've got Doge. They don't even need to do anything. They just need to talk about the potential for trimming $2 trillion July 4th, 2026. Fine. So that's just like out there in the ether. You don't have to collect revenue from tariffs. We collect $72 billion a year in tariffs. In order to offset the $4.6 trillion, right, from the $2 trillion deficit, boom, the tariffs are going to raise $2 trillion. That's the CRFB proposal. If you tariff everything at 10% or 60% on China, you can make these numbers exist in the ether. But in the end of the day, 51 Senate Republicans are going to have to vote to increase the deficit by $2.5 trillion. That's massive. Politically, that is so painful. So you have all these ideas circulating out there just to paper over the political discomfort that comes historically with Republicans blowing out the deficit like that in what will be the biggest reconciliation bill in American history.
Yeah.
That's what we're facing right now.
And I feel like that goes back to our conversation a few moments ago, where does it matter? And I think that's something that the general public comes back to is, you said it's 36 trillion. Most people don't even know that. And so if you say, hey, guess what, guys, it's now 44 trillion, does anyone even care?
This is where the Senate matters more than the president. It matters to the senators because they will get primary. Senator Corker lost his job after he took a vote in 2017 to increase the deficit to $1.5 trillion to pay for the original bill. These Republicans will be confronted with deficit hawk primary challengers. And that's why you have members like Chip Roy, for example, who will not vote for a debt ceiling increase. If you have a 0 vote margin in the House, you can't pass this bill with Chip Roy. You won't vote for it. There are members out there that have that deficit default in the Conservative Party, and this is a political problem for them, and they will lose their jobs. And that's really the issue.
And I feel like it's just another thing that's politicized, because this raising of the debt ceiling seems like, the sun coming up tomorrow. Like, it just happens so frequently, it seems, that I feel like these are all just topics that just American voters kind of get numb to.
Yeah. And I think that's why we maybe are inching closer to actually, messing around and find out with defaulting on the debt. I mean, I think it would be pretty catastrophic. Trump has said as recently as 2023 that he doesn't care if we default, just see what happens. He famously wasn't president then, so we'll see if he cares now that he is president. I'm sure it'll be a different calculus for him.
Of course.
But, the nuances of the debt ceiling, I think, are very real. And they've been a much bigger issue since 2011 when we had the Budget Control Act and Speaker Boehner and myriad speakers have lost their jobs over the debt ceiling. Speaker Boehner lost his job over the debt ceiling and a government shutdown. Paul Ryan did, Eric Cantor did, Kevin McCarthy did. I mean, you lose your job when you take these votes. That's how serious.
Yeah. So I guess before we go to Canada and Mexico, like in the same vein here, no, because this is important. I think it kind of puts like a bow on it. We talk all about the debt. And I think that's something, if you look at Republican administrations, the tagline is, we're going to cut your taxes and we're going to cut spending. But it seems like when we look at the math, lots of times it's cut your taxes, but then the cut the spending doesn't quite really happen. Sometimes we keep it the same or increase spending in some scenarios. And hence, we see these bigger and bigger deficits. So I think it's silly if we go back to the tariffs will raise the revenue. That's just kind of like putting like a drop in a bucket. I don't think that's kind of moving the needle. If we look at the budget just real quick, I want to share with everybody, right now, Medicare, Medicaid, that's the biggest line item, $1.8 trillion a year. Social Security comes behind that at $1.5 trillion. And then something that I have always thought is insane, and it's a little more recent, is that our third biggest expense is just servicing debt, that we spend $1 trillion a year just servicing the interest on our national debt. And that is the third biggest expense. And now defense spending, which is like $950 billion, that comes after interest, which is frightening to me. I think it's harder to say, let's raise the revenue to address the debt. I think these things at the forefront, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, are so obvious, but I don't feel like anyone pays mind to those. And don't you think that that's a bigger concern than, oh, we got 50 billion here or 50 billion there?
Yeah, it's the only way to fix it for sure, but it's also the third rail of politics. I mean, I get a kick out of, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy saying they're going to, force people in the federal government to come into the office, and that's going to reduce the deficit. Give me a break. It's like $150 billion. If you fired 25% of the federal workforce, it's nothing. The path forward is precisely as you suggest. The last time we had a serious conversation about this was in 2012 when we had the Erskine Bowles Commission, Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson Commission. We had the Super Committee. There were efforts to impose a $1.2 trillion sequester back in 2011. We've proposed these ideas, but quite frankly, first of all, the last president that had a surplus was Bill Clinton. And then immediately George Bush came in and passed tax cuts that spent all that money, put us in the hole, and we've never come back. Because American politicians do not ever vote to raise your taxes. The worst they could do is vote to extend the existing rates, which is what we had in 2010 under Obama, and then again in 2012 under Obama. And then Trump came in and cut them again, but only temporarily so, which is why we have all these cliffs all the time. And that's to do with our reconciliation process. But spending just does not go down. It will not go down next year. I just walked through the NDAA and the CR. I mean, we will continue federal spending. It will increase, at least to do with inflation. And that's because the House and the Senate matter more than the president when it comes to spending. And the president has almost no authority there, and constitutionally so. We've seen that tested in 1974. We saw it tested under Bill Clinton when he tried the line item veto. The power of the purse is with Congress. Until you can find 60 votes in the Senate, you're not going to cut federal spending. But when you do, if you want to do something meaningful, you need to raise the retirement age and start not giving Social Security out or Medicare out to folks who don't need it, and many other changes besides.
It seems so commonsensical to me. This is frustrating, especially with Social Security, that as a financial advisor, I'm intimately acquainted with clients. And it's like, how can you say in 1945, the normal retirement age is 65, and then in 2024, it's 67? It's just, we're living longer. Like, it seems so simple to say, okay, let's bump it to 69 or 70. And if we give American people some advance notice of that, I don't think anyone would jump off a cliff. I think that we would embrace that. And then meanwhile, that would be an immediate, tremendous savings that no other little bit of revenue would even come close to.
Yeah, I mean,
drives me nuts.
I totally understand. It is so obvious. I'll give you just like a couple random anecdotes. I mean, one of the things that's true on Capitol Hill is that members who are elected now do not feel responsible for debts incurred by past administrations and past Congresses. I think it's something like 83% of the current Republican Party was not here when we did TARP, and they ran against TARP. They ran against federal spending and all the initiatives that blew out our deficit. So they don't take responsibility for that deficit level because they never voted for it. So why do they have to be the ones that raise the retirement age, piss off all the senior citizens who are the most prolific voters in the nation and potentially lose their primary races? So there's not an incentive structure to really address it.
Yeah, and I guess that goes all the way back to where we started of like us versus a China or Russia, where they don't have to think in such of these micro segments like our elected officials do. But in any event, maybe a good way to kind of round out our conversation would be moving off of us and China and Canada, Mexico. There's obviously other players here in the world. What are some of the other things, be it there or elsewhere, that we're going to see in the next administration, or that maybe even investors or just the public has to be aware of?
Yeah, I think the Canada and Mexico tension is always going to be pretty stark. As you know, deportations and closing the border are a main priority of President-elect Trump. But the facts on the ground are that immigration at the southern border has dropped back to 2022 levels. ICE is at max capacity. They are working, very diligently to make sure that the borders are as closed as they can be.
But isn't that like a recent phenomenon?
Since January. Yeah. So
Yeah,
roughly a year now.
yeah, it's because it does seem like we just kind of let things go wild for like a 3-year stretch.
Right. And so now they've been dropping, by 50, 40% every single month since January. And so my point there being ICE is effectively doing the most that it can do. When you talk to them anecdotally, they'll say, we really are doing literally everything in our power, everything under the executive order blanket that we can do. So Trump campaigned on cracking down on immigration even further, which means that we really need Canada and Mexico to stop migration at their borders. And so the Remain in Mexico policy, or a Mexican policy to keep more migrants in Mexico, to unwind two of the caravans that are coming through right now, is something that they're working on. Those are issues that I think will be addressed in the near term to avoid the 25% tariff that Trump recently floated on Twitter for fentanyl and immigration. I don't think that tariff will go on, but it's all to set the stage for USMCA renegotiations in 2026. With Canada, we have issues over lumber and dairy and things like that. With Mexico, we have issues over Chinese inbound investment to try to flout the regulations and tariffs that we're putting on via Section 301 against China directly. So those are issues that we'll sort out over the next 2 years. I think two to be mindful of is I think that the potential for the US EU auto tariffs to come back as a major headline risk is very real. On March 31st, the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariff suspension expires, meaning those tariffs come back on March 31st. And I think the US and the Trump administration in particular have a real big problem with the EU auto sector. So that's something to be mindful of. And then
Why do you say that? As in, like, the EU auto sector is coming from countries we don't like? Is that?
No, it's to do with the EU having manufacturing plants that Trump and his USTR basically consider chop shops, where they're just assembly lines, but all the high skilled labor for batteries, for transmissions, and the heart of a vehicle that really creates R&D and high paying jobs is conducted in Germany. That's all done over there. And then they bring those big, huge components of the vehicle over to the United States, and we throw the doors on the car. They really want it to be a more robust domestic manufacturing component with higher paying jobs for those auto workers. So that's a big source of contention beyond just the regular agriculture stuff that we have.
Isn't that one? It just seems like, to kind of put on like the general public face, it seems like that's one that we could let go. It's not like, it doesn't have that sensitivity people worry about of like weapons or medicine that we want so badly to have total control over. And if it's Germany that's doing this great auto manufacturing and not China, it's Germany actually building these engines. Like, wouldn't we say that, hey, that's a good partnership? They're better at it than we are. Let's leverage that. Or is it just because that's upsetting, jobs in Detroit?
I think President-elect Trump has very real problems with that specifically, and they are much more expansive than just autos, whether that is from their investment in defense for NATO and things along those lines. They want more agriculture trade with the EU. So those issues all get tied together. But you can see Trump speaking very forcefully on the campaign trail, and Bob Lighthizer, about the auto sector in the EU and how furious they are about those high-skilled jobs being conducted in Germany and then flouting our rules of origin and our domestic content requirements to get around tariffs on fancy cars like Mercedes-Benz and Audis and BMWs. They have a real problem with that.
Interesting. Okay. So what are maybe some other items or kind of close that out? I know like the headline one for 3 years there was the southern border. Canada, I know you mentioned lumber. Is that so much a concern of immigration at all, or is that really just focused kind of on our southern border?
I think fentanyl in Canada is definitely a source of concern, and those other issues that you just mentioned, dairy and lumber, are very real issues in the trade universe. So I think that will be a part of the renegotiation conversation that we have in 2026, which will start in 2025. But the real sleeper issue that I think could come up on trade in the out years, aside from those EU auto tariffs, is India. And so I think that there is a very real potential for a Section 301 investigation into India. As you know, that was the source of consternation for the first Trump administration. They stripped India of GSP status and never really got anywhere. And the pandemic obviously upset that. But I think an investigation into India around chemicals, generic pharmaceuticals, their services industry, those are all areas that we have issues with. So the 2026 to 2029 timeframe could be, or 28 timeframe could be really interesting to watch.
There's just so much here to chew on.
Yeah.
I guess maybe to kind of close out, like, what would you like to see? Because it seems like so many of these things, particularly the sensitive ones, the chemicals, medicines, weaponry, that if we could, we'd almost want to be isolationist on and say, okay, we have total control of that. So there's not a threat to that structure. But obviously that's not realistic. We always have to have some kind of a broad partnership. I guess what would we want to see there? What would be like the happy end game? Because it just does not seem feasible that you have America and China, the two biggest superpowers, two biggest economies, shake hands and say, okay, we're happy, let's work together. It sounds nice, but it just doesn't seem like we don't want that. And obviously China definitely doesn't want that. So it just seems like so complicated of how the two of us move forward with all these other players around the globe.
I mean, nobody wins a trade war, I mean, we all have to live on this planet together. But that's what makes this job so exciting and trade law so fascinating. And I think it's worth highlighting why Bob Lighthizer likes the enforcement mechanism so much. You do have to work together. You do have to have rules of the road. And one of the things that the WTO was designed to create is laws for the international community to adhere to. And the way that you create a law is to enforce it and to build it and to create case studies and have countries comply. And that wasn't happening. And that's why, we're breaking this down even further. That's Trump's whole mantra
Sure.
and contention.
And just to kind of close that out, because I know that all makes sense, and you kind of enforce these things and say, okay, if China's a bad guy, we don't want them profiting off of sending their stuff to Germany or wherever else it may be. So we want to block that. But aren't there always, just like a tax law, isn't there always a workaround? Where
with trade, absolutely. Supply chains are incredible.
And that's my whole point is I feel like you see it so much just in our business with tax planning and, how do the rich guys not pay that tax? Because as soon as the law comes out the next day, us and their accountants are saying, okay, well, we'll do X, Y, and Z. Isn't that happening around the globe where if you have a smaller country that knows they need something from Taiwan or from China or wherever, that if we say, well, you can't do that, then they just create a quick workaround. Is that like very impactful? Or when we come out with like, one of these bans or rulings, do we capture maybe 90% of it and 10 slides under the radar where then it's like, okay, we expected to have a little bit of a loss there? Or is it like not effective? I guess what's like the efficacy of some of these?
Yeah, I mean, then you're just playing whack-a-mole. You can see it in Vietnam and Malaysia and other nations where you just have transshipping and you're just avoiding and working around the tariffs that the U.S. has put on. You also have to contend with retaliation. I think that's overlooked a lot. When we tariff a nation, they tariff us back. They penalize our domestic industries as well. So you take one step forward and two steps forward and one step back every single time you do this. It just so happens that the U.S. is the most powerful. China, for example, cannot tariff $350 billion worth of our goods the way that we are tariffing $350 billion worth of theirs, because they don't even import that much in the first place. So they have to move to a proportional response. And that's the same with the EU. And they try to hit you where it hurts. So tech trade is very political. And that's why you see under a Republican president representing red states, you see the EU targeting red state issues, for example, Kentucky bourbon, et cetera. That's the kind of response you get. So China responded by hitting our farmers. Those are red state senators who were theoretically going to put the squeeze on Trump to call off the tariffs. And ultimately, Trump was so politically popular with the Republican base of voters who actually turned out that those Republicans had to change their view and couldn't combat him with tariffs. And so that's the big shift you've seen in the Republican Party, in my opinion, more than anything else, is the move away from free trade and towards whatever this idea of fair trade is. And fair trade is just, continuously hitting people. And it serves a lot of purposes. It gives you an enemy, gives you an action item that you could deliver to your voters. And theoretically, it delivers revenue, but it also hits GDP growth. It forces corporations to constantly be in flux and moving their manufacturing plant from one nation to the other. Which one is safe? Is Mexico safe? Is it okay to have your plant there? I spend a lot of time with investors now saying, what are the risks to Mexico? I thought we had NAFTA. We have for the last however many decades. Is it still a good idea? And with Trump, you create this business uncertainty that it is exhausting. It's great for business, but it's exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah, that is very, very interesting. And I think that kind of with the whole tariff thing right there, when you said, you take 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards, I think if that's the math, then we could just kind of knuckle up and say, okay, we're just going to keep doing this again and again and again. As long as we don't take 2 steps forward and 2 steps backwards, that's where, I feel like as long as there's just a slight gain, if we have enough slight gains, then it is a benefit. But
well, I don't know what gain has been so far. I mean, $72 billion in revenue is not 1 step forward. That is inching. And instead, we've created an opportunity for China to go to Russia and other nations and expand its growth into Argentina and Brazil, as I mentioned. I mean, no one wins a trade war.
Yeah. No, I see the complexity there, and I hate the revenue thing. I think that was a mistake almost bringing that up because it sounds so naive that is one of the advantages. If it is even the slightest advantage, I don't think it's worthy of kind of advertising. Thank you so much, Henrietta, for the time. I don't know if you have a closing thought you could share. Lots of times I like to ask a guest, if you could change one thing about the world right now, what would it be? With kind of that idea, is there anything that you could leave our listeners with?
Oh, no, that's a terrible question. I will say the first thing that comes to my mind, I live in Louisiana, and I'm not a native of Louisiana. I've lived here for 15 years, though, and I'll tell you, hurricanes scare the heck out of me. So if we could do something about climate change, that would make me really happy. That's a big ask.
All of these seem to be very big asks, but that's duly noted. So thanks again, Henrietta, for the time. This was very informative.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Sure. All right, everyone. Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of the Caderna Podcast. Wherever you're listening or watching, be sure to like and subscribe. Tell a friend. I'm Brian Caderna. Today, we've had the pleasure of speaking with Henrietta Treyz. I'll leave her contact and some places you can read about her work in the show notes. And we will see you next time. Hello. This podcast is intended for the general public and for informational purposes only. The show does not provide any recommendations or investment advice regarding any specific account type, service, strategy, or product, or to otherwise act in any fiduciary or other capacity. Please contact a financial professional for guidance and information that is specific to your situation. Brian Caderna does not provide tax or legal advice. Please contact your accountant or legal advisor to discuss your situation. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by Park Avenue Securities, Guardian, or Caderna Financial Team, and opinions stated are their own. All investments contain risk and may lose value. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. References to specific securities, asset classes, and financial markets are for illustrative purposes only and do not constitute a solicitation, offer, or recommendation to purchase or sell a security. Brian Caderna is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, PAS. OSJ 300 Broadacres Drive, Suite 175, Bloomfield, New Jersey, 07003. Phone number 973-244-4420. Securities products and advisory services offered through PAS, member FINRA, SIPC. Financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. PAS is a wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Caderna Financial Team is not an affiliate or subsidiary of PAS or Guardian. California Insurance License Number 0K04194.